Well, hello there. Welcome to day 3 of our MS-102 Microsoft 365 Administrator course. So, we're going to have a fun day today, no doubt. A lot of information to talk about and to spend some time with. Just as a reminder, please use the Q&A window for all of your questions. The Q&A window for all of your questions, please. And that will help you to see other people have most likely asked the exact same question, or the information's already been provided there for you. Okay, well, let's take a look at what we have in store today. Now, just as a note, for yesterday, we had the day 2 stuff that we talked about. What did we talk about yesterday? Well, we've got the implement identity synchronization. So day 2 covered things like exploring identity synchronization, preparing for identity synchronization to Microsoft 365, preparing for identity synchronization, including ID Fix, a downloadable tool from Microsoft that helps to make sure that you have a nice, clean environment in your Active Directory structure. Okay. Implementing directory synchronization tools and managing and implementing directory synchronization using either Entra Connect Sync or Cloud Sync. So Entra Connect Sync is the tool that you download to your system, to your enterprise, and so it will have its own server, right? But then Entra Cloud Sync is going to be an agent-based configuration. Note, it is recommended to have 3 of those. Then managing identity and access in Microsoft 365. So we talked about the zero trust security model and how it is exactly that. You don't trust anything. Very pessimistic model, right? Because of how things are in the world today, right? So we try to lock things down, verify explicitly, principle of least privilege, and assume breach is inevitable. Then we discussed how to manage secure user access in Microsoft 365, the authentication methods, working with SSPR, or the self-service password reset. Then we also discussed a bit of Defender XDR, and I likened it to having like a security system, right? So a complete security system will be made up of a variety of different tools, and not just one tool will take care of all the needs that we're going to have. So the Defender XDR environment is a combination of tools for a nice complete solution. Okay, so we talked about some of those tools that went into Defender XDR, and then the fact that it is a centralized single pane of glass, you might say, to look at incidents, to manage responses, and other sorts of things. And so we discussed as well how to respond to incidents and alerts that are generated by XDR, including hunting, and how the hunting piece requires the use of KQL, or the Custo Query Language. Note that if you want to work with KQL, you haven't worked with it before, take a look at working with Copilot and ask Copilot to help you to generate certain types of queries for you. Then it will build the KQL and get you going on queries that you can use to help you with your hunting. We also discussed Secure Score and how the Secure Score environment is a way for you to evaluate your current structure, right? Your current security posture, but then also ways to enhance it by looking at the security score that has been tied to your particular account. Then we dug into managing your security services in Defender XDR, where we talked about EOP, right? Examining email protection. So how EOP gave you a great first line of defense, but then to enhance that further, we have MDO, Microsoft Defender for Office 365, for threat policies and rules, email protection, and then even being able to investigate and respond to email and collaboration threats. We ended yesterday with talking about more Defender XDR, and we discussed threat intelligence and threat protection. And so we discussed how to explore that, some of the tools that were part of this, to review and respond to issues that were identified in the reports. Note the reports are important. These tools can't just holler at you. They write stuff down and put them into reports for you to review later. So make sure you do review those. And then also to review and respond to threats identified by threat intelligence, how to implement app protection with Defender for cloud apps. And so your SaaS apps, your PaaS apps, even your corporate apps, you can control, kind of acting as a broker, right, or a middleman between your users and your apps. That actually allows you to gate access or even deny access to certain apps based on certain settings. You can interpret the activity log. You've got Cloud App Discovery and respond and review issues in Cloud App Discovery. So, lots of stuff we covered yesterday. Today, if you look at the slide, it just looks a little more lightweight, but there's still a lot in there, right? So we're going to talk about exploring data governance in Microsoft 365. And so we're going to talk more about Purview today. In fact, all this is basically Purview. Okay, all this is Purview. So welcome to Purview Day. Okay, so we're going to talk about retention labels, retention policies, and retention label policies and how those integrate or work in conjunction with Microsoft 365. Then we'll implement compliance in Microsoft 365 and talk about that, including things such as DLP or data loss prevention. And then we'll discuss DLP policies for Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams. And then we'll end the last section of being managing compliance in Microsoft 365. This has to do with data classification of sensitive information. So we'll talk about SITs, sensitive information types, and implementing and managing those using keywords, keyword lists, or even regex or regular expressions. We'll discuss sensitivity labels and implementing those labels and policies that are associated with them. So lots of fun stuff to talk about. So we're going to start off with exploring data governance. Exploring data governance in Microsoft 365. We're going to spend some time with examining data governance solutions in Microsoft Purview. So we're going to be introduced to Purview. This is to meet the challenges of today's decentralized, data-rich workplace by giving you a common, comprehensive set of solutions to help organizations to govern, protect, and manage, their entire data estate. So a bunch of tools to help you out. And so one piece of this is that we're going to take a look at exploring our data governance and compliance in Microsoft Purview. Now, the amount of data that organizations around the world generate is a lot. On average, companies experience a 50% year-over-year growth of electronic data. So basically meaning every year and a half, they double the amount of data that they have. And so managing that much data can be a lot to handle in an organization, especially where we're looking at data isn't just in emails, but it's also in files, it's in documents, it's in videos, it's in chats, and so on. So it's no surprise that companies struggle to even manage the liability and risk associated with data governance and with compliance. And the fact that many companies don't even know what data they have, where it's located, what their data is doing, makes things worse, right? So maybe you've said things like, hey, my data is scattered across a variety of different sources, or when enforcing compliance, our business users' productivity is disrupted, right? How should we manage all that data that's scattered all over the place? How do we manage it while it's continually exponentially growing? How do we apply policies universally, right? Can we make data governance something automatic so we don't have to hire somebody to just do that for us? Right? How do we find relevant data when we really need it? So to address those concerns, Microsoft 365 gives you a state-of-the-art compliance solution known as Purview. So some of you, if you've been doing the Microsoft thing for a while, you'll note that you've had the security portal, and then you had a bunch of tools that started being built in there that eventually broke out into the compliance portal. And now the compliance portal is called the Purview portal, right? So you've got the Purview portal. But the idea behind Purview is that it targets 3 core aspects that every organization generally does require. Number 1, the preserving of vital data. Number 2, the finding of data that's preserved and then understanding what's there. And then the last one, the auditing, the reporting, and the monitoring of business activity to ensure that users are abiding by business policy rules, business processes, and industry regulations. And so Purview does provide some core functionality. Now, it is a unified data governance service that does help organizations manage and govern its on-prem, multi-cloud, and SaaS data, right? Software as a service data. And there are 3 core pillars that go into it. Number 1 is going to be data governance. And so with data governance, this is making sure that users have the tools available to import, to store, to preserve, to retire, and even to expire data as it leaves an organization's data retention windows. Number 2, e-discovery, right? So finding information quickly, ensuring it's relevant to a user's request. And then number 3, auditing. Right, so this is enabling organizations to monitor and even investigate all the actions taken within the compliance solution and on their data. So doing so ensures that nothing outside the norm is actually happening. And so really, Purview gives an organization the opportunity to create a holistic and up-to-date map of its data landscape with things like automated data discovery and sensitive data classification, even end-to-end data lineage. This also enables organizations to have data curators to manage and secure its data estate, and this will also allow organizations to empower data consumers to find what it is that they're looking for, right? Find valuable, trustworthy data. So the Purview platform does support tools like a data map, and the data map is going to be that foundation for data discovery and effective data governance. And so that is a cloud-native platform as a service that captures the metadata about your enterprise data present in analytics and operation systems on-prem and in the cloud. Okay, so business users can configure and use Purview data map through the UI or using APIs. And then we also have the data catalog at our disposal. So with that data catalog, business and technical users can quickly and easily find relevant data using search with filters based on lenses like glossary terms or classifications, sensitivity labels, etc. And so if you're working with subject matter experts or data managers and officers, the data catalog itself gives various data curation features, for example, business glossary management, and the ability to automate tagging of data assets with glossary terms. Then you have data estate insights. So that Purview Data Estate Insights tool is going to be a data management solution as well, cloud-based, giving you a unified and automated way to discover, understand, and manage data across an organization's hybrid data landscape, but helping to ensure that you're managing your data assets more effectively and ensuring compliance with industry regulations like GDPR or HIPAA. But Purview Data Estate Insights also provides advanced governance capabilities like data lineage, right? Seeing where it began and how it's progressing, data classification and cataloging. And those features help organizations understand how data flows through their systems, ensuring data quality and improving collaboration across teams. So Purview is there to help solve data discovery challenges for organizations, right? So it helps enterprises get the most value from their existing information assets. So yeah, Purview is there to help out. Really, there's some big advantages to working with Microsoft Purview. For example, the data gets to remain in its location. Authorized personnel within the organization add a copy of metadata and reference to the data source location into Purview. Then Purview is going to index that metadata to make sure each data source is easily discoverable. Okay? Which means that users can quickly find data that matches their needs. They can understand the data to evaluate its fitness for whatever the purpose is, and they can consume that data by opening the data source in the tool of their choice. And so one of the features of working with Purview is what's known as Purview information protection. Purview information protection. One of the things that organizations struggle with typically is knowing what their data is that they have out there. So really, you have to know your data first, right? Before any of these things, you got to know what data you have out there. So understand your data landscape and then identify the important data across that hybrid environment. Okay, once you know your data, where it lives and all that fun stuff, where it's traveling to, then you got to protect it. And so you can apply flexible protection actions like encryption, access restrictions, visual markings if you wanted to. After that, then you have to also think about preventing data loss, right? So detecting risky behavior, preventing accidental oversharing of sensitive information. So data loss prevention is a big piece of this. And then finally, governing your data, right? And so this is for you to automatically retain, delete, store data and records in a compliant manner. Well, guess what? Purview gives you these capabilities to know your data, right? So knowing where your sensitive data resides is often the biggest challenge for organizations. And so Purview information protection, data classification helps you to discover and then accurately classify the ever increasing amounts of data that your organization creates. And so graphical representations help you gain insights into the data so you can set up and monitor policies to protect and govern it. And so things like sensitive information types are a piece of knowing your data. So this is where you can identify sensitive data by using either built-in or custom regular expressions or even a function. And so corroborative evidence includes keywords, confidence levels, and proximity. You also have what's known as trainable classifiers to go along with this. So these identify sensitive data by using examples of data you're interested in rather than identifying elements in the item, like pattern matching, which is what you typically have with a sensitive information type. So you can actually use a built-in classifier or train a classifier with your own content. And note, the more positive stuff, the more data that you have that you're training your trainable classifier with, that's going to match whatever it is you're looking for, the more accurate that classifier is going to be. And then you also have classification. So this is also part of knowing your data. And so a graphical identification of items in your organization that have a sensitivity label or retention label. But it also includes classified items. So you can use this information to gain insights into the actions that your users take on these items. And so you can get a good idea through things like the Content Explorer and Activity Explorer for your data classifications. Now, you also need to protect your data. And so knowing where the data is great, but this helps you to more efficiently protect it. So you can protect your data immediately with doing some manual work if you wanted to, working with some default components or even automatic labeling, and then taking advantage of Content Explorer and Activity Explorer to confirm what items are labeled and how the labels are being used. So you do have these things called sensitivity labels. And so a single labeling solution across all your apps, services, and devices to help protect your data as it travels inside and outside of your organization. You also have a Microsoft Entra ID protection unified labeling client. So for Windows computers, extending the labeling to File Explorer and PowerShell. So they can use that labeling feature that's typically in the cloud also on their client. Double key encryption, right? So under all circumstances, only your organization can ever decrypt protected content, or for regulatory requirements, you must hold encryption keys within a geographical boundary. Office 365 message encryption, otherwise known as OME. Right? So this encrypts email messages and attached documents sent to any user on any device, so only authorized recipients can read emailed information. So you've got your sensitivity labels. You can apply those labels across the board. You can use Defender for cloud apps to apply labels in the cloud, right? So Defender for cloud apps will discover, label, and protect sensitive information that resides in data stores that are in the cloud. Okay. And then the last one that's up here on this page is preventing data loss. And so deploying Purview DLP and those policies will help to govern and prevent inappropriate sharing, transfer, or use of sensitive data across apps and services. So those policies help users to make the right decisions and even take the right actions when using sensitive data. And so what's needed? Well, first off, you got to learn about DLP, right? Which is a little bit of what we're doing right now. So take the time to understand a little bit about it, study about it, read about it, and then try to plan out an implementation of it. See, when working with data loss prevention, then this is going to help prevent the unintentional sharing of sensitive items. And so then you build DLP implementations and policies, right? So plan out DLP, design and create your DLP policy, and then tune those policies, because many times we'll make things a little too restrictive, right? So we want to make sure that we do a bit of tuning to make sure it's not too restrictive, that users can still do what they need to do in order to get their work done. So we've got information protection. We also have Purview data lifecycle management. Okay, lifecycle. So all documents, all data has a lifecycle. What's current today isn't going to be current tomorrow, right? So we want to make sure that we can maintain a life cycle for our data. And so the Purview data lifecycle management gives organizations the tools and capabilities to retain content they need to keep and delete stuff that they don't. And so organizations must often retain and delete content for compliance and regulatory requirements. But deleting content that no longer has business value also helps organizations manage risk and liability, like reducing an attack surface. So retention policies are going to be the cornerstone for data lifecycle management. And so organizations should use these policies for Microsoft 365 workloads that include Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Yammer, and Teams. And the organization should configure the retention period for content in these services. Note, it does not matter if the organization must retain the data indefinitely or for a specific period if users edit or delete it. Or if the data is still available, the organization can configure the policy to permanently delete the content automatically after a specified period. So the policy can combine these two actions for retention and then deletion. And so this scenario is a typical configuration. So for example, retain email for 3 years and then delete it. So when you configure a retention policy, you can target all instances in your organization if you wanted to, like all mailboxes and all SharePoint sites, or even individual instances, and like only mailboxes for a specific department or region, or SharePoint sites, specific ones. But organizations sometimes need to also do exceptions, and so those are things that can be done as well. And then some other pieces that go into lifecycle management to help an organization keep what they need, delete what they don't, include things like mailbox archiving. So this will provide users with extra mailbox storage and also provides auto-expanding archiving that for mailboxes that need more than 100 gigs. A default archiving policy automatically moves email to the archive, right? So if necessary, you can go in and customize the policy for that. You also have inactive mailboxes. So when working with data lifecycle management, if you have an inactive mailbox, after an employee leaves the organization, a mailbox can be retained. You also have an import service for PSTs, right? So network uploads, drive shipping, whatever the case might be, can be part of this as well. Okay. So we do have data lifecycle management to take a look at. Now, how about insider risk management? Insider risk management. Well, Microsoft Purview Insider Risk Management is a compliance solution to help minimize internal risks, helping organizations to detect, investigate, and act on malicious or inadvertent activities. So insider risk policies enable an organization to define the types of risks that it wants to identify and detect, also enabling organizations to act on cases and escalate cases to Microsoft e-discovery premium if needed. Now, an organization's risk analyst can quickly take appropriate actions to ensure that users are compliant with the organization's compliance standards. So, some of the modern risk pain points that we have in organizations, managing and minimizing risk in the organization starts with understanding the types of risks that are involved, right, in that modern workplace. So external events and factors outside of your organization directly drive some of these risks. So notice just some of these behaviors that could be deemed as illegal, inappropriate, unauthorized, or even unethical. Leaking of sensitive data and data spillage, confidentiality violations, intellectual property theft, fraud, insider trading, regulatory compliance violations, right? So there's a whole bunch of different activities that can be deemed as not so good, right? So insider risk management will use the full breadth of service and third-party indicators to help you to identify where those are happening. And so the following principles form the foundation of insider risk management. You've got transparency. So this is going to be a balancing of user privacy versus organization risk with privacy by design architecture. It's configurable as well. Okay? So configurable policies based on industry, geographical, and business groups. It's integrated, right? So integrated workflow across Microsoft Purview solutions, and it is actionable. So this provides insights to enable reviewer notifications, data investigations, and user investigations. Okay. So insider risk management can help organizations to not be breaking laws, right? So when working with data leaks, maybe data theft by departing users, perhaps we have some security policy violations, maybe patient data misuse, right? Then we can use some of the features that are part of the Purview environment, like alerts, to help us out in understanding where these things are happening. And so inside of the Purview environment, you do have insider risk management and the ability to look at any alerts that have been generated. So you can look at all of the alerts, maybe open alerts over time, alert statistics for an organization, but what you're looking at as well is its current status, its severity, when it was detected, and if a case was opened. Okay. Now, sometimes these alerts are false positives, so you may have to triage a little bit, right? So new user activities that need investigation will generate alerts, and so you'll need to triage those. And any of the following tasks can help resolve an alert, either opening a new case or assigning an alert to an existing case or even dismissing an alert. Okay, so then once you get those alerts, spend some time investigating, right? And as investigators examine the activities, they may say, nope, this was okay. It's benign, so we're going to dismiss that alert. Or we're going to share the link to the report with other investigators. Maybe we'll choose to temporarily or explicitly assign the user to an insider risk management policy due to certain behaviors. Okay, and so you can take any needed actions in order to protect the organization. How about e-discovery? Exploring Microsoft Purview e-discovery solutions. So e-discovery is the process of actually identifying and delivering electronic information that organizations use as evidence in legal cases. Legal cases. Okay. So subpoenas, if the organization has data that comes through as being subpoenaed for a legal case, e-discovery comes into play. So when using e-discovery to identify and deliver electronic information, you can search mailboxes and sites in the same e-discovery search and then export those search results. You can use Purview e-discovery standard and the cases there to identify, to hold, and export content that's found in mailboxes and in sites. You can also manage custodians of that data and analyze content by using the Purview e-discovery premium solution. And so you do have to have a subscription for that, right? The right licensing. And so when looking at e-discovery solutions and Purview, of course, we've got our content search, and that content search tool will search for content in Microsoft 365 data sources and then export the search results to a local computer. You also have e-discovery standard. Okay, so e-discovery standard builds on the basic search and export functionality of content search, and it enables you to create e-discovery cases and assign e-discovery managers to specific cases. But those e-discovery managers can only access the cases of which they're members. With e-discovery standard, this also lets you associate searches and exports with a specific case. That you can also put a e-discovery hold on content locations relevant to the case. With premium, you can do all that stuff and then more, right? You've got an end-to-end workflow to identify, preserve, collect, review, analyze, and export content that's responsive to an organization's internal and external investigations. Okay, so you've got a whole bunch of stuff, a whole feature set of things that you can do with e-discovery premium. Okay. Now, we've talked about working with data, right? Data governance. Let's talk a bit about data retention. Data retention. This is how long we're going to keep data around. And so we're going to discuss how Microsoft 365 will support data governance by enabling organizations to archive content using things like an archive mailbox and restore deleted data in Exchange Online and SharePoint Online. Okay. So let's dig into retention with retention policies. Actually, give me a quick sec here. Okay. So exploring retention by using retention policies and retention labels. Okay, so retention policy is how long we're going to keep data. And so we build a policy around that, right? And so for most organizations, they constantly have more data. And so effectively managing and governing that amount of information is important because organizations will need to comply proactively with any regulations that they fall under, right? This will also help to reduce their risk if there's a litigation or a security breach by permanently deleting old content that they no longer need to keep. I know some folks are, and some companies are data hogs, right? They're data hoarders, and so they really like to have a ton of data, right? So that could be a kind of a liability to them, right? So in order to help keep the liability to a minimum, note that some government regulations will require organizations to store certain types of content for, let's say, 7 years. If you keep it beyond that, you now have a risk. You're now breaking the breaking the policy or the regulation that you fall under. Reduce risk if there's litigation, right? And share knowledge effectively. Be more agile by making sure that users work only with content that is relevant. Only content that's relevant. I've seen some data stores that have data that in the live active store that's well over a decade old. I'll guarantee they're not using that data anymore. And so retention settings that an organization can configure will be things like how they're going to retain that content. So they will prevent permanent deletion and remain available for e-discovery, or it gets to a point where it can be deleted permanently from the organization. And so with these two retention actions, organizations can configure retain only settings, right? So keeping content forever or for a specified period of time. You've got delete only. So permanently delete content after a specified period of time, or very commonly retain and then delete. Keep content for a specified period of time and then permanently delete it. So those retention settings that work with content in place really can save organizations the extra overhead of creating and configuring extra storage when they need to retain content for compliance reasons. Plus, it can save organizations from having to implement customized processes to copy and synchronize data over. So those retention settings go into play. They can work with content in place. In other words, you don't have to move them to another spot in order to define their retention. So a retention policy will enable an organization to effectively manage their data even in place. So when content has retention settings on it, then users can continue to edit and work with the content as if nothing has changed. They're able to do so because the system retains the content in place and in its original location. But what happens if users edit or delete content included in the retention policy? Well, in that case, the system saves a copy of the content as it appeared when it applied the policy to a secure location. Okay, so it'll keep the copy in its original state in the location while the policy is in effect. So when for SharePoint and OneDrive sites, the system keeps a copy of the original content in the preservation hold library when users edit or delete it. For Exchange mailboxes, the system will retain a copy in the recoverable items folder. And then for Teams and Yammer messages, they're also held in the Exchange recoverable items folder. Now, when looking at retention policies and retention labels, an organization can assign its retention settings to content by using retention policies or retention labels with label policies. So an organization can use just one of these methods, or it can combine them together. Note that a retention policy can assign the same retention settings for content at a site or mailbox level, and also use a retention label to assign retention settings at an item level, like a folder or document or email. Okay, so let's say that in your company, you want to retain all documents in a SharePoint site for 5 years. So more efficient to implement that plan with a retention policy than to apply the same label to all documents in that site. However, if the company needs to retain some of the documents in that site for 5 years and others for 10, a retention policy wouldn't be able to accommodate that. So when you need to specify retention settings at an item level, you need to use retention labels. You got your policies and you've got your labels. So unlike retention policies, retention settings from labels travel with the content if you move it to a different location within your company's Microsoft 365 tenant. In addition, those retention labels have the capabilities, have some capabilities that retention policies don't support, like being able to use a trainable classifier to identify the content, or applying a default label for SharePoint items or Exchange messages, marking the content as a record as part of label settings. Okay? So lots of fun stuff that you can do with these. Those retention policies can be applied in things like Exchange, both in email, in public folders. You got SharePoint sites and OneDrive. You have Teams chats and messages, even private channels, and Yammer messages. So organizations can effectively and efficiently apply a single policy to multiple locations or to specific locations and users. Now, when using retention labels, note that organizations should use labels for different types of content that require different retention periods, right, and different retention settings. So you can use the labels for, notice, an organization must retain tax forms for a minimum period of time, or an organization wants to permanently delete press materials when they reach a specific age, etc. So with the retention labels, organizations can enable their users to apply retention labels manually to content. And users often know what the best type of content is that they're working with, and so as such, they can classify it appropriately. You can also allow labels to be applied to content automatically if it matches specific conditions. So they could be things like sensitive information types or specific keywords, or even pattern matches that come from a trainable classifier. So yeah, you've got a lot of capabilities here. Note that a single retention label can be included in multiple retention label policies, and retention label policies specify the locations to publish the retention labels. Note that the same location can be included in multiple retention label policies. So when we take a look, this fun little chart, this will be a nice one for you to kind of spend some time with, right? But comparing the capabilities in policies versus labels, and there's a couple pages worth of information here. Okay? So note your retention settings that can retain and then delete, retain only or delete only is a capability of both a policy and a label. What workloads are supported? Well, with policies, all of these locations, right? Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Microsoft 365 groups, Skype for Business, Teams, Yammer, right? Retention policies can apply. Labels can only work with Exchange, not public folders, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft 365 groups. Can a retention be applied automatically for policies and for labels? Yes. But notice this. Automatically apply different retention settings at the end of a retention period. No for policies, yes for retention label. Or retention applied based on conditions, whatever it might be, right? KQL queries, sensitive info types, whatever the case is. Retention policy, no. Retention label, yes. In fact, you'll notice there's a lot less flexibility with the retention policy. Okay. It cannot be, the retention label works across the board on all of these, but it cannot be applied, a retention cannot be applied manually. There is no end user interaction. It cannot persist if the content is moved. It cannot declare an item as a record. It cannot start a retention period when labeled or based on an event. There is no disposition review. There is no proof of disposition for up to 7 years. You cannot audit the retention actions, and there is no way to identify items subject to retention through content search or through things like the Activity Explorer, right? But you can audit admin activities, right? The rest of these labels could do. Right? So labels for specific items, policies for general settings. So you can use a combination of the two. In fact, when they're used together, they can complement each other for a more comprehensive solution. Now, how about the scope of a retention policy? So when an organization creates a retention policy or a label policy, it needs to define the scope as either adaptive or static. Adaptive or static. And so adaptive scope uses a query that you specify. So membership is dynamic rather than static. And the reason it's dynamic, it runs daily against the attributes or properties you specify for selected locations. And so you can use multiple adaptive scopes in a single policy. So, for example, emails and OneDrive documents for executives may require a longer retention period than standard users. So you create a retention policy with an adaptive scope that uses the Entra ID attribute job title of executive, right? And then you select the Exchange email and OneDrive account locations for the policy. No need to specify email addresses. No need to specify OneDrive URLs for these users because the adaptive scope automatically retrieves those values. With a static scope, it doesn't use queries because the system limits its configuration to 3 different choices, right? So it can apply to all instances for a specified location. It can use inclusion and exclusions for specific instances, but the 3 choices are sometimes referred to as org-wide, includes, and excludes, right? So in a little example with emails and OneDrive documents for executives require a longer retention period than standard users. And so you can create a retention policy with a static scope that selects the Exchange email and OneDrive account locations for the policy. So for the Exchange email, you're able to identify a group that contains just the executives. You then specify the group for the retention policy. The system then retrieves the group membership with the respective email addresses when you create the policy. Now, for the OneDrive account location, you need to identify and then specify the individual OneDrive URLs for each executive. So it may be a little bit more challenging to set up a static scope over an adaptive scope, but there are advantages to each one, right? When it comes to the adaptive scope, there is no limit on the number of items in a policy. It's more powerful targeting for your retention requirements. So you can actually assign different retention settings to users according to something like geographic location, right? It's query-based membership, so it's dynamic, right? So sometimes group membership doesn't reliably reflect a business change. So a query-based membership gives you that resilience against those sorts of situations. You can have a single retention policy for both Teams and Yammer. Okay. And why is that important? Well, because your static scopes require their own retention policy for Teams and for Yammer. And you can also only apply specific retention settings to inactive mailboxes in a adaptive scope. Okay. And so this configuration is not possible with a static scope. There is a couple benefits of using static scopes. Static are simpler, right? You just specify specific workloads, right? And you also can't use adaptive scopes for Skype for business public folder locations and Exchange public folder locations. You do need static scope for that. Now, what about the principles of retention? See, unlike retention labels, an organization can apply more than one retention policy to the same item, and then each retention policy can result in a retain action or a delete action. And even though an item might have a retention policy applied to it, the item can also be subject to these actions from a retention label. So while both retention policies and labels can have retain and delete, and it's the system that enforces those actions, it may get kind of confusing after a while, right? So one says keep, the other one says get rid of it. So notice the conflict resolution that's labeled here, okay? So this is the principles of retention. Note, number 1, retention wins over deletion, okay? Retention wins over deletion. Then number 2, the longest retention period wins, right? So let's say 2 of them are retention policies, but one has a longer period than the other one. Great, then the longest one will win. Number 3, an explicit wins over implicit for deletion. So let's say you've got 2 or more that are set to delete. The ones that are explicit or more specific will win over more implicit deletions. And last one, shortest deletion period will win. Okay, this is just a good little chart to keep in mind for those principles of retention. Now let's talk about retention using retention policies, labels, and e-discovery holds. Okay, so retention settings and holds that you create with an e-discovery case can each prevent data from being permanently deleted. Okay, so Microsoft designed these two things, retention settings and these holds, for different scenarios. So notice retention settings. If you're working with retention policies and labels, you get to specify the settings that designed for a long-term data lifecycle management strategy. The purpose of those settings is to retain or delete data for compliance requirements. Compliance requirements. Okay? And so usually the scope is broad, main focus being the location and content rather than individual users. And the start and end of the retention period is configurable. For holds with e-discovery, organizations can create e-discovery holds for e-discovery standard and premium cases, but in both cases, organizations design these cases for a limited duration to preserve data for a legal investigation. And so the scope is specific, with the focus being content owned, identified by users, right? So who the users are. And so the start and end of the preservation period isn't configurable, but rather dependent on individual administrator actions. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You've got two things that are there to hold data, but they serve two totally different purposes. Now, we also have this thing called a preservation lock. See, organizations in a variety of different industries have to abide by rules that are defined by regulatory bodies like the SEC. And one of those rules can affect how organizations deal with data retention, requiring that an organization turn on a policy for retention. And once it's turned on, it can't turn it off or make it less restrictive. Guess what? That's the purpose of a preservation lock. Okay, so you've got your preservation lock. It locks a retention policy or a label policy so that no one, not even an administrator, can turn it off, delete it, or make it less restrictive. So you apply that preservation lock after creating the policy or a retention label policy. The preservation lock locks a retention policy or retention label policy so that no one, not even global admins, can turn it off. They can't delete it. They can't make it less restrictive. This means that an organization can meet regulatory requirements and also help them to safeguard against any rogue admins trying to delete stuff. So when you lock a retention policy, note that no one can disable it. No one can delete that policy. You can add locations to the policy. You cannot take out locations. You can extend the retention period, but you cannot decrease it. If you've locked a retention label policy, no one can disable the policy or delete it. You can add locations to the policy, but not remove them. You can add labels to the policy, but not remove them. So in summary, you can increase or extend a locked policy, but you cannot return or reduce or turn it off. So when it comes to implementing preservation locks, you need to use PowerShell to turn those on and turn on the retention or preservation lock. Okay, so to place a preservation lock on a policy, you'll use the set-retention compliance policy, identify the policy, and then specify -restrictive retention $true. -restrictive retention $true. And that's going to turn a preservation lock on that data. Now, how about compliance in Microsoft 365? Good old compliance. Okay, so when we talk compliance, give me a quick sec here. Okay, when we talk compliance, we're going to talk about data governance features, right? So we'll spend some time more with some purview here, but we'll discuss data governance features, how to calculate your compliance readiness, implementing compliance solutions, creating information barriers, DLP policies, policy tips. We got a lot of stuff to cover here. So when we explore compliance in Microsoft 365, we have to talk about purview. Okay? Talk about purview. And so when planning your security and beginning your compliance in purview, okay, there's some things that you need to look at. First off, identifying and managing compliance risks. Identifying and managing compliance risks. That is crucial to make sure that we safeguard our data. Okay. And so there are a variety of different tasks that need to be walked through to make sure that we are following compliance processes and controls. And so after an organization understands what they need to do, then they can look at purview to help them to enforce. For example, look at these 8 different tasks that are listed. Number 1 is your configure compliance permissions. Now, Purview Compliance Portal gives you the easy access to the data and the tools that an organization needs in order to manage its compliance needs. And so it's important to manage who in an organization has access to the Purview Compliance Portal to view the content and perform management tasks. So Microsoft 365 does provide administrative roles to support compliance and for using the tools that are part of the compliance portal. So make sure that whoever is going to have to take care of this falls under either the compliance data administrator or the compliance administrator roles. Okay. And then also assigning users to the global reader role if they want them to view data in the compliance manager tool. Okay, so make sure that we've got the right permissions, the right users in the right spot. Task number 2, know the state of your compliance. You don't know where to go if you don't know where you are, right? So to meet compliance needs, an organization must understand its current level of risk, what things they need to change in order to be up to date. And so the single best thing an organization can do to improve compliance is to understand its current state. Okay. So Purview Compliance Manager can help an organization understand its compliance posture, also highlighting areas that may need improvement. So Compliance Manager uses a centralized dashboard to calculate a risk-based score, measuring an organization's progress in completing actions that help reduce risks around data protection and regulatory standards. So an organization can also use the Compliance Manager to track its risk assessments. So it does provide a workflow capability to help an organization efficiently complete its risk assessments through a common tool. Number 3, enable auditing. Enable auditing. And basically you get in, you turn on auditing. But organizations should have determined its current state, assigned permissions, but now we need to make sure that we're conducting compliance investigations, generating reports for network and user activities. And so auditing is going to be a big piece of that. And so insights provided by the audit logs are a valuable tool in helping to match an organization's compliance requirements to the solutions that can help it manage and monitor compliance areas needing improvement. Note that by default in Microsoft 365, it's going to record user and administrator activity in the audit log retained for 180 days. Number 4, create policies to alert you about potential compliance issues. So Microsoft does provide several built-in alerts and alert policies that help you to identify things like permissions abuse by administrators, malware activity, potential external and internal threats, and even data lifecycle management risks. Note that Microsoft 365 turns on these policies by default, but you may need to configure custom alerts to help manage specific compliance requirements. Number 5, get in, classify, and protect that sensitive data. So users in an organization often collaborate with other users that are inside as well as outside the company. So by doing so, content no longer stays behind a firewall. Instead, it can roam everywhere across devices, apps, services, and when it roams, organizations want to do so in a secure, protected way that meets compliance policy. And so organizations can take advantage of sensitivity labels to help enforce message encryption or enforce usage restrictions, even put things in place like visual markings and protect that information across any platform and device, both on-prem and in the cloud. Number 6, configure retention policies. We've already spent some time on that. Retention policies are going to be great for industry regulations, internal policies that specify how long content is allowed to stay alive. Number 7, configuring sensitive information and offensive language policies. Okay, so protecting that sensitive information and detecting and acting on workplace harassment incidents is an important part of organizations quickly detect, capture, and even take remediation actions for email and Microsoft Teams communications. Those risks can be things like profanity, it can be threats, it can be harassment, maybe communications that share sensitive information inside and outside of the organization. So there is a predefined offensive language and anti-harassment policy that can be implemented, and it can work on things like Teams, email, and things like that. But then your predefined sensitive information policy templates can work with any of that data. Lastly, number 8, you can see what's happening with your sensitive items. So once you've gone through and you've done all your labeling and classifying of all that stuff, now you can see what is going on with that data. And so organizations can use Microsoft 365 features to classify and label things using sensitivity labels, sensitive information types, retention labels and policies, and trainable classifiers. Once you've done all that, then you want to see where it's going. And so there's a couple of tools can help you out. One of them is the Content Explorer. Content Explorer enables an organization to view in their native format all the items that the system classified as a sensitive information type that belong to a certain classification by a trainable classifier and that have a sensitivity or retention label applied. Those things are found in Content Explorer. What about Activity Explorer? Okay, well, Activity Explorer helps organizations monitor the steps taken with its classified and sensitive items. So Content Explorer to look at the content, the Activity Explorer to look at the steps taken with classified and sensitive items. This could be in SharePoint, Exchange, and in OneDrive. Bunch of different filters from date ranges to locations to users that can be used. You can also manage your compliance requirements with Compliance Manager. Well, that's pretty sensible name, right? So that Compliance Manager is a feature in Purview Compliance Portal, but its purpose, help organizations manage their compliance requirements with greater ease and convenience. And so Compliance Manager can help an organization to complete the steps of taking inventory of its data protection risks, managing the complexity of implementing some controls, staying current with regulations and certifications, and reporting to auditors. Compliance Manager can help with all these things. And so it helps to simplify and reduce risk by providing pre-built assessments, right? So this is for common industry and regional standards and regulations. You have your own custom assessments that you may want to work with. You've got workflow capabilities to help you to efficiently complete risk assessments in one tool. A detailed step-by-step guide on suggested improvement activities. And so the instruction gives an organization the opportunity to get caught up, right? To comply with standards and regulations that it finds most relevant. And a risk-based compliance score help you understand your compliance posture. It'll measure your progress in completing improvement actions. And so The compliance manager dashboard maintains those features. So it will show an organization its current compliance score, help you to see what needs attention, and then guide you in key improvement actions. So it's a very powerful tool at the disposal of organizations. And so just a quick little look here at the compliance manager dashboard. You'll notice we've got our compliance score that's listed here, solutions that affected your score. You'll notice it even tells you remaining actions that go along with it. Okay. You've got the overview. You have improvement actions listed, some solutions and assessments that can be put in place, and also alerting is a piece of this. Alerting is a piece of this as well. So big, important area for you to understand what your organization needs to do in order to improve their compliance score. In fact, a little bit more about the compliance score. If we take a look at this compliance score, the compliance manager dashboard will display the organization's overall compliance score, and that tells you how you're doing, right? But it'll also let you know what you could do to improve your action score. So each action has a different effect on the company's overall score, and the effect depends on the potential risk involved with the action. You also have a control score. So this score is the sum of points earned by completing improvement actions within a control. So compliance manager applies the sum in its entirety to the company's overall compliance score when the control meets the condition of either implementation status equals implemented or alternate implementation, or the test result equals passed. And you have an assessment score. And so this score is the sum of the control scores. So compliance manager will calculate it using the action scores, and then it counts each action and each improvement action managed by the organization once, regardless of how often a control references the action. So you can get your scores, right? And those scores are associated as well with some actions you can perform in order to improve your score. Now let's talk a little bit about DLP. DLP, data loss prevention. When you build a DLP policy, DLP is implemented by defining and applying DLP policies. So those DLP policies are there to protect organizations and their sensitive and confidential data by detecting when users expose, misuse, and mishandle data. And so DLP policies get rolled out. DLP will detect sensitive items by using deep content analysis, not just a simple text scan. Plus, machine learning comes into play to help it generate data content to see if it matches the policy. DLP provides insights and reports to help an organization to understand their data landscape and any risks and threats to their data. Those policies allow organizations to monitor activities and even take actions on activities that seem to be nefarious. Now, with the DLP policy, you can identify, monitor, and automatically protect sensitive items. So when a user does try to do something that breaks the policy, right, then they may get something like a pop-up tip saying, hey, you sure you're trying to do this? It's not really something that we really allow, right? Or block the sharing, and then through a policy tip, allow the user to override the block, right? We may block the sharing without an override. We may lock and move sensitive items at rest to a secure quarantine, and we may even prevent Teams chats from displaying sensitive information. So it depends on the type of data, where your users are, how much training you've done as well, as to which one of these you'd want to do. When it comes to DLP, it's going to combine conditions, actions, different search patterns to look for, and locations to protect or to exclude. So a condition might be something like a content containing confidential information shared with someone outside the organization, like a credit card number or some PII or something like that. An action might be block access to the document and display a tooltip, or send both the user and a compliance officer an email notification. Once you build the policy, you define where it's going to go. Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. You can go into Teams, things like that. So when building your DLP policy, you need to decide what it is you're going to monitor. Okay, so what type of data? There are predefined templates to help you out, or you can build your own custom templates. You also define your administrative scoping, right? So admins who are assigned to an administrative unit can only apply policies to users and groups they're assigned to. Where you want to monitor, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, right? Pick those spots, what the condition is, and then the action that's going to be taken, like blocking access or sending notifications. Note that an organization can choose to run DLP in simulation mode. Strongly suggested. Many times when a policy is first put together, we make them very restrictive, and so this will help you to see what you can do to make adjustments to the policy to make it, I don't want to say less restrictive, but a little more productive for the users without having to block them out of absolutely everything all the time. And so endpoint data loss prevention extends the activity of monitoring and protection from Microsoft Purview DLP to sensitive items that are actually on a Windows box, Windows 10, Windows 11, and also in Mac OS devices. So devices that were onboarded through Defender for Endpoint can have device monitoring turned on using Endpoint DLP. So Endpoint DLP, you can audit activities like, hey, we're copying data to USB removable drive. So we've got some sensitive data, we're moving them over there. Maybe we're copying to a remote session or creating an item or renaming an item. Your Endpoint DLP can pinpoint this sort of information. Okay. Device management enables the collection of customer data from devices. Right, so this data includes any info that users create, store, process, transmit in an organization, including text, images, audio, video, and other digital types of digital content there. Okay. So lots of stuff you can do with the Endpoint DLP. Okay. We also have what's known as adaptive protection in Purview, adaptive protection. So this is going to use machine learning. It's going to identify the most critical risks and proactively and dynamically apply protection controls. This is cool stuff, right? We don't always think of absolutely everything to do. So if we have a tool that can help us out, like Purview and the adaptive protection, then we can further protect our environment. And so policies become adaptive based on user context. So you may have some high-risk users. And so those high-risk users then, you may want to apply the most effective policy, like blocking data sharing or blocking application access. Low-risk users, well, you may still want them to continue doing their job, right? Maintaining that user productivity. And DLP and conditional access constantly can adjust. So when a user's risk level changes, then Purview will dynamically apply the appropriate policy for that user. Okay. Those risk levels, which define how risky a user's activity is, do have some built-in definitions, like an elevated risk level. These are built-in definitions for users with high severity alerts, or users with at least 3 sequence insights that each have a high severity associated with their activities. You have a moderate risk level, at least 2 data exfiltration activities or with a high severity score, or minor risk level. Okay, so any users low severity or at least 1 data exfiltration activity with a high severity score. Okay, so different risk levels based on the activities that they have performed. And so for a risk level to be assigned to the user, the number of insights and the severity assigned to the activity needs to match the risk level. And so adaptive protection then in Purview integrates with Purview Insider Risk Management with DLP. So when Insider Risk identifies a user engaging in risky behavior, they're dynamically assigned to an insider risk level. In turn, adaptive protection can automatically create a DLP policy to help protect the organization against that risky behavior. And as user insider risk levels change in insider risk management, DLP policies can be applied to the users and adjusted as the risk level changes. You can also manually create DLP policies that help protect against risky behaviors that insider risk identifies. So you'll notice this is a combination of tools in order to make adaptive protection in Purview go to work with DLP. Okay. And so looking at the results then, when you take a look at the compliance portal, you can look at things such as the policies that you defined, any classifications of that data that's out there, activities that have occurred on your data sources and your assets, and even get a chance to look at the audit logs and records from Purview. Okay. All in that compliance portal. Okay, so DLP can be used with Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. It gives you unified data protection. I can help you identify sensitive data like PII, and then monitor data across SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, and Teams to help prevent data leakage using block, alert, or encrypt actions, and then help to educate your users with tips, real-time policy tips. So far, we've talked about data governance in Microsoft 365, using Purview, retention in Microsoft 365, retention labels, label policies, and retention policies. Then we've also discussed compliance in Microsoft 365 with Purview data loss prevention and configuring DLP for SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. When we come back from a 5-minute break, this is just a screenshot. Okay, well, we're going to come back in 5 minutes. And when we come back, we will continue on in our journey. Okay, so that's a broken image there. Okay, so we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Okay, so I'll do this so it doesn't throw anybody off. See you back in 5. Thanks. Okay. Welcome back. Man, 5 minutes went really quick, didn't it? Okay. So we're going to keep on trucking. We got just a little bit of time left, but so we'll take a look at compliance, managing compliance in Microsoft 365. Managing compliance. Give me a quick minute here. Okay. One of the first things we need to spend some time with, we've been talking a lot about sensitive information, haven't we? Sensitive information. So we need to talk about implementing data classification of that sensitive information. And so we're going to be introduced to data classification in Microsoft 365, how to create, how to train classifiers, viewing sensitive data using Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, and even this thing called document fingerprinting. So first things first, data classification. You know, sensitive data does present a risk to a company if it ever gets in the wrong hands, right? So what we want to do is make sure that that stays protected, and protecting that data and the information a business manages should be top priority for an organization. But some might find it difficult to know if their efforts are truly effective. And so, because there's so much data out there, how do we know we're being effective? Right. And then, in addition to volume, the content may range from being very important, highly sensitive, and impactful to just everyday stuff. Right. So it can be under the purview of various regulatory compliance requirements. Knowing what to prioritize, where to apply controls, man, that can be super difficult. So organizations need to find a way to identify, categorize, and protect content according to its sensitivity or its impact level. And there's a variety of different ways to do it. One way is by using sensitivity labels. Okay, so sensitivity labels is one way. You've got your sensitive information types, you have what are known as retention labels, and you have your trainable classifiers. But see, the data classification components really come into play to help protect our data. And so a data classification framework is a formal enterprise-wide policy typically comprised of 3 to 5 classification levels. And so those 3 to 5 different classification levels may include a name, a description, and a real-world example. Now, Microsoft recommends no more than 5 top-level parent labels, each with a maximum of 5 sub-labels. So for a total of 25 labels to keep the UI manageable. And so the UI typically arranges the levels from least to most sensitive, right? Like public or internal, confidential, highly confidential. So you'll notice from least to most, from public to highly confidential. You may have some other ones like restricted or unrestricted and consumer protected. Note that Microsoft does recommend label names that are self-descriptive and clearly highlighting their relative sensitivity. So confidential and restricted may leave users guessing which label is appropriate. But if you've got confidential versus highly confidential, well, that's different, right? So to protect content, data classification frameworks will define the controls that should be in place for each data classification level that you have. So this would require a well-designed data classification framework. Okay? And so some things that to think about if you don't have something right now, just don't expect to go from 0 to 100 on day one, right? It's going to take some time to come up with these. Note you're not just writing for cybersecurity professionals. Try to avoid jargon, right? That's going to be confusing to your end users. Implement your data classification framework. See, it's not enough to just design it, but you need to implement it. Okay. Only go granular if you need to, right? So just because you can include 5 levels doesn't mean necessarily that you should. Get the right people involved and make sure you've got stakeholders, right? Senior stakeholders critical for success. They'll help you with this. And then balance security against convenience. See, a common mistake, draft a secure policy, but then overly restrictive data classification framework. Right? You don't want that. So organizations can define the security, but they don't want to make it so tough that it just wrecks the life of the user that's out there having to take advantage of it. Also keep in mind that a data classification framework only addresses what your organization should do to protect sensitive data. Data classification frameworks usually include data handling rules or guidelines that define how to put those policies in place. And so when it comes to data classification in Microsoft 365, Microsoft 365 data classification features do help an organization gain insight into what it is that is being classified. Okay? And so you can evaluate and tag your content in your organization. And so as such, you can do something like control where it goes. You can protect it no matter where it is, and even preserve and delete the data according to what your organization's needs are. Okay? But data classification in Microsoft 365 will scan an organization's sensitive content and labeled content before the organization creates any policies, known as zero change management. So that actually enables an organization to see the effect that all the retention and sensitivity labels are having in their environment. Okay. And in Microsoft 365, visibility into tagged content is provided on a data classification page in the Purview Compliance Portal. Okay. So it allows you to discover, classify, review, and even monitor data in accordance with data classification framework. Okay. Now, part of this is working with things like classifiers. And so the idea behind classifiers is that you've got some something there to help you, a strategy to classify and define new categories of sensitive information and content. And so let's talk a little bit about classifiers then. One of those tools that we have is a trainable classifier. Okay, so yes, you can go in and manually build stuff, right? So manual classification, that requires human judgment, that requires human action. Okay, and so you can evaluate the content and then apply or classify the data. You can also do automatic pattern matching, right? That's a pretty common one. So it looks for certain keywords or metadata, looking for particular patterns as well. It can recognize an item because of a variation. But then you have trainable classifiers. So Microsoft 365 Trainable Classifier is a tool that you can use to train to recognize various types of content. So Microsoft 365 has a huge list of predefined classifiers, but organizations can create their own custom classifiers. Train them, give them samples to look at. Note, the more samples you provide, the better off you're going to be. Once it's trained, then the organization can use it to identify items for application of your sensitivity labels, any communication compliance policies, and retention label policies. Okay, so training a classifier, notice it says give it between 50 and 500 samples. Once again, the more, the better. And note, testing the classifier's ability to predict by giving it a mix of positive and negative samples. Okay, positive and negative samples. And then retrain the classifier over its lifetime to help improve performance. Hey, the way that we do data may change with time, right? So there's times where we have to get in and retrain or update our classifiers. Now, there are two different types of trainable classifiers, and one of them is pre-trained. Okay, so ones that are like adult, racy, gory, right? Maybe they're based on discrimination, customer complaint. They might be looking for healthcare data, source code, right? But you can also create your own custom classifiers. And so the pre-trained may not match your needs. Great, create your own. So what's involved is create a custom trainable classifier, feed it examples that are definitely in the category. Okay. Once the classifier processes those examples, test it by giving it a mix of both matching and non-matching examples. The classifier then makes predictions as to whether any given item falls into the category you're building, and then you confirm the results, right? You sort out the true positives, the true negatives, the false positives, the false negatives, and that's going to help the classifier get more accurate. And once you're satisfied with the test results, deploy the classifier by publishing it. So for example, you could create a trainable classifier for legal documents like attorney-client privilege or closing sets. This could be for pricing information like for invoices, price quotes, bidding documents, or even other sorts of financial information like investments, quarterly or annual results, stuff like that. Building your own classifier. So when creating and training or retraining your trainable classifier, as an organization uses the trainable classifier, it may want to increase its precision, right? So precision can be increased by evaluating the quality of the match and not a match classifications made by the classifier. So creating that trainable classifier, remember, you're going to give it 50 to 500 seed content items. They need to be samples only. They must strongly represent the type of content that you're training it on for it to detect. Okay, put all that content into SharePoint and then sign into Purview, get in and build your classifier and point it to that data. Now, once that classifier is trained, well, then we may have to get in and retrain it. Note, after 30 evaluations are made for a classifier, it takes that feedback and automatically retrains itself. Okay? So pre-trained classifiers that are provided with a Microsoft 365 tenant can't be retrained. The only ones that can are your custom ones, the ones that you create. So as an organization continues to use that custom trainable classifier, it may need to get in there and retrain it. So when you're in the Purview portal, under data classification, look for your Content Explorer, and then filter on labels, info types, or categories down to your trainable classifiers and get in and start working with that trainable classifier, right? So now you start feeding it other data, right? So a published classifier is already being used, items get classified, and so this could be with your sample data, and then admin uses the feedback to let it know, hey, this is a match or it's not a match, right? And so after 30 instances of feedback, then the classifier will retrain itself. And note, an admin will do a side-by-side evaluation of the retraining predictions and current published classifier predictions. All right, so how well is it doing? Well, is the retrained classifier better than the current published version? If not, do you want to improve it? Well, yeah, go back here and keep feeding it stuff, right? Keep training it. And then keep walking through this until you get to the point of, is the retrained classifier better than the currently published version? Yes, publish it to make it available for use. A couple of tools that we have at our disposal to look at our sensitive data is Content Explorer and Activity Explorer. The Content Explorer is there to give you visibility into the amount and types of sensitive data in your organization. So it also enables users to filter by label or sensitivity type, and doing so displays a detailed view of locations where the system stores that sensitive data. So administrators get the ability to index sensitive documents stored within the Microsoft 365 workloads. They can identify sensitive information that's stored in each document, and they can even identify documents that the system classified with sensitivity and retention labels. Okay, but with the Activity Explorer, well, this is going to show the activities related to sensitive data and labels. So for example, label downgrades, external sharing that can expose content to risk. And so Activity Explorer is going to display the activities related to that sensitive data, okay, that's done by end users. So this could be things like any label activities, DLP logs, auto labeling, and even stuff that's collected from Endpoint DLP. Okay. Note that there are certain licensing requirements. So that's going to be one of those fun things you're going to want to spend a little bit more time on, is reviewing the licensing in order to take advantage of Content and Activity Explorer. And we also have what's known as document fingerprinting. Document fingerprinting. Document fingerprinting does make it a lot easier for organizations to protect sensitive information by identifying standard forms that an organization does use. Okay, so just some basic scenarios for document fingerprinting. Note that it is a DLP feature, but it converts a standard form into a sensitive information type. And the organization can then use that information type in its policies. So for example, an organization can create a document fingerprint based on a blank patient template. And then they can create a DLP policy that detects and blocks all outgoing patient templates with sensitive content filled in, and then optionally set up the policy tips to notify senders that they may be sending sensitive information. And then any sender receiving the policies tip should verify the recipients have permission to receive that patient data. And so that whole process works with any text-based forms. So that could be government forms, that could be HIPAA forms or employee information forms, custom forms that are created specifically for an organization. So how does this work? Well, Microsoft Purview DLP will identify the unique word pattern in the document, and then it'll create a document fingerprint based on that document and that pattern. Then it will use that document fingerprint to detect outbound documents that contain that exact same pattern. Note that this process will show why uploading a form or a template creates the most effective type of document template or fingerprint. Okay, everyone who fills out a form uses the same original set of words, and then they add their own words to the document, but the fingerprint still looks the same. Okay. And document fingerprints support a wide variety of file types. Okay. So, in case you're curious. All right. So far, implement and manage sensitive information types by using keywords, keyword lists, or regular expressions. So just some keyword detection methods, right? It'll detect specific words like confidential or salary or DL. Okay. Keyword lists, so you can actually identify context using grouped business terms. You also have regex or regular expressions, so matching structured data like IDs and numbers, and some benefits in using these sorts of sensitive information types. Accurate data classification, it can help you to reduce false positives, and really it already does have a strong foundation with DLP policies. Okay, implementing sensitivity labels. Okay, so we're going to talk about sensitivity labels, applying proper administrative permissions, determining a deployment strategy, creating, configuring, publishing labels, and even removing and deleting labels. Okay, so one of the first things that we take a look at is planning your deployment for those sensitivity labels. Now, in order to successfully deploy sensitivity labels, an organization should create a project team that will identify and manage the business and technical requirements, the proof of concept testing, the internal checkpoints and approvals, and finally, the final deployment for the production environment. So rather than building a large number of sensitivity labels all at once, it may prove more effective for organizations to plan and deploy sensitivity labels in small increments. So when coming to this, some of the things to think about: address one or two key scenarios that map to its most impactful business requirements, right? So start off small yet big. Create and configure sensitivity labels for those situations, then validate the effectiveness of the labels and settings, and then modify those that need adjustments. Lastly, repeat the process for the next set of impactful scenarios. Okay. So Microsoft does provide a lot of guidance on how to get all of this taken care of. And yeah, there's a lot of wonderful things that you can help with that can help your users. And so organizations should include these tasks when planning their deployment strategy. Study the documentation links for scenarios that map to their most impactful business requirements. So you can ask Microsoft about that by going to their page. Use the Copilot tools to help you too. Provide end users with customized guidance and instructions for label names and configurations to choose. And then use the label policy setting. Provide users with a link to custom help page to specify internal link for any documentation. Okay. So that internal documentation can really help with guidance and instructions for label names and configurations. When it comes to sensitivity labels in SharePoint and in OneDrive, two primary reasons why organizations should enable sensitivity labels for Office files and PDFs. Number one, so that its users can apply company sensitivity labels in Office for the web. But also so that SharePoint and OneDrive can process the contents of Office files and PDF documents that were encrypted using a sensitivity label. See, the label can be applied in Office for the web or Office desktop apps and uploaded or saved into SharePoint and OneDrive. Now, until you enable sensitivity labels for SharePoint and OneDrive, those services cannot process those encrypted files. So collaborative features like co-authoring or e-discovery, DLP, even search won't work for those files. But after organizations do enable sensitivity labels for files in SharePoint and OneDrive, then there are some conditions exist, like for Word, Excel, and PowerPoint and uploaded PDFs, SharePoint and OneDrive will recognize the label and can now process the contents of the encrypted files. When users do download or access the files from SharePoint or OneDrive, then the sensitivity label and any encryption settings are enforced and remain with the file. When users upload labeled and encrypted files to SharePoint or OneDrive, they have to have at least view usage rights to those files. So for example, they can upload files outside of SharePoint. If they don't have this minimum usage right, the upload is successful, but they don't get to see it. Use Office for the web to open and edit Office files that have sensitivity labels that apply encryption. The permissions that were assigned with the encryption are going to be enforced, and you can also use auto labeling for those documents. Any external users can access documents that are labeled with encryption by using guest accounts. And e-discovery supports full text search for these files, and DLP policies support content in those files. But see, after you enable sensitivity labels in SharePoint and OneDrive, then you have three new audit events available. Applied sensitivity label to file, change sensitivity label applied to a file, removed sensitivity label from a file. So some requirements for those sensitivity labels then. So three main things, got to create them, right? So when an organization's ready to start protecting, they got to create the sensitivity label. That's the name, the label itself, that's going to be used, the taxonomy for it, and use common names that make sense for your users, okay? Like private, public, personal, confidential, highly confidential, whatever the case may be. Then define what each sensitivity label can do. Okay, so configure protection settings. So for example, you may want lower sensitivity content like general to have just a header or footer applied, whereas you may want higher sensitivity content like highly confidential to have a watermark and encryption. Then publish your labels. Okay, get in and publish those labels. And so after configuring the sensitivity labels, publish them by using a label policy. Okay. So yeah, some things you can do with those. And so when you get in and actually create the sensitivity label, an organization must first create and configure the labels it wants to make available for apps and other services. So you got to get in under information protection in Purview and under labels, create a label. Okay, get in, create the labels, and now you can start applying other settings to them and getting them published out. Note, as best practice, organizations should have as few label policies as possible. Notice it's not uncommon for an organization to have just one policy for the entire company. Not uncommon. Okay. Now, as you build the sensitivity labels, you can take and publish those sensitivity labels. Note, by default, tenants don't have any label policies, so you do have to create them. But then once you get in, you start creating your labels, you can start publishing your labels. This starts the create policy wizard, and then the label policy is published when you complete the wizard. If you do need to make any changes to the published policy, get in and edit it. Note, you don't need to republish afterwards, like in the case of many things that have a publish feature. Please note, though, for labels and label policy settings, give it 24 hours to marinate, right? To settle into place. It could take 24 or even up to 48 hours. So this is one of those things that you may want to set up on a Friday, come back Monday, and it should be good to go. We also might want to remove sensitivity labels and delete them. So in production environments, it's unlikely that we're going to have to remove a sensitivity label or delete it. More likely, we may need to remove or delete labels during the initial testing, but not after it's settled, right? So if we want to get in, we want to remove a label from a label policy. That's a lot less risky than deleting it, okay? Because you can always add it back later. No, you can't delete a label if it's still in a label policy. But an organization removes a label from a label policy, so that label is no longer published to the original specified users. Okay? So next time you refresh the label policy, that label is not available anymore. But if you've already applied the label, the system doesn't remove it from the content or the container. So users that are using built-in labeling in desktop apps like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint will still see that applied label on the status bar. An applied container label continues to protect Teams or SharePoint sites. So you can remove it. You can also choose to delete it, right? In comparison, deleting can have a lot of different implications. Note these that are on this pink rounded square. If the label applied encryption, the underlying protection template is archived so that previously protected content can still be opened. Okay, so that's good stuff. The label information in the metadata remains, but because a label ID to name mapping is no longer available, users don't see the applied label name displayed. Also, users don't see the label name on the status bar or in the sensitivity column. The label information in the metadata remains only if the label didn't apply encryption. Okay. So when looking at sensitivity labels and sensitivity label policies, you can protect and classify organizational data using those labels. So sensitivity labels can classify data. Remember, try to keep them as small as possible, yet unconfusing as possible. They can be used to classify data like public, internal, confidential, highly confidential. They can do activities like apply encryption, access restrictions, content marking. They can also persist protection across files, emails, and collaboration tools. Your sensitive label policies can publish labels to users and groups, enforce default and mandatory labeling, and even educate users with label descriptions and tool tips. In fact, you can even direct users to help if you wanted to. What's the outcome of implementing these things? Consistent data protection, secure collaboration, and improved compliance posture. So with this learning path, what did we cover? Well, we talked data classification of your sensitive information. We discussed implementing and managing sensitive information types using keywords, keyword lists, regular expressions, implementing sensitivity labels and implementing sensitivity labels and policies. Now, you've got some homework, right? You've got the learning paths for exploring your data governance in Microsoft 365, data management best practices, implementing compliance using insider risk management, information barriers, and DLP, right? Data loss prevention, configuring endpoint DLP, reviewing and responding to DLP alerts, events, and reports. And then you'll also notice managing your compliance in Microsoft 365 through sensitivity labels and monitoring label usage by using Content Explorer, Activity Explorer, and also a feature known as label reports. There's also some labs to work through, 7, 8, 9, right? On configuring in-place archiving and retention policies, managing DLP policies, and even testing the DLP policy out. Lastly, implementing sensitivity labels. So that's going to conclude day 3 of the MS-102 course on Microsoft 365 administration. I hope you have a great day, and we'll do this again tomorrow. Thank you.
with to access data repositories. Clearly a conversation about infrastructure resources. Of course, I just mentioned that I just commented before we started this activity that we need to appreciate how you provisioning the required infrastructure. But please keep in mind that if a team of infrastructure engineers, they want to manually administer the underlying infrastructure, they can do it. Vertex AI also supports to manually configure, for instance, connecting your pipeline to a Kubernetes cluster. If you want to control and create and administer manually a Kubernetes cluster, you can do that as well. I'm talking about Vertex AI being a fully managed platform that would automatically provision and especially handling scalability. However, there is also an option of manually configuring and setting up how and how much of those underlying infrastructure resources are provisioned. Okay, let's keep that in mind as well. What is this? There is one more. After being trained on millions of lines of code, a system can automatically suggest the next line of code a programmer is likely to write. This is describing what the large language model does, and in general talking about models, right? Training models. When you see training, when you see a reference to training, some kind of entity is usually referring to models here. And finally, I can guess without even reading, what is this one? Software program can monitor a company's social media feeds, identify negative customer sentiment, and automatically draft a response to address the issues, right? We can implement that using agents, right? So this is applications specifically designed to react to certain events, in this case, social media feeds, and do something and implement an action based on that, right? Yes, that's good. I'm looking at the chat here, some comments that I basically agree with. So now the rest of the section here is divided in these layers. Okay, we're going to start overviewing applications and agents is an overview. When GenAI platform models and infrastructure, we're going to go more in detail, but applications and agents, we're going to just introduce these two layers because again, tomorrow we have two dedicated modules actually on building GenAI applications and agents, and not only building, operating them. I would say that probably the most important part is not the design and development, but especially the operations, maintenance, running them in production, right? And again, we're going to cover up to platform and models here now. So we're going to cover the first two, the top two layers here, GenAI applications and agents. There is a way to stack these layers, but agents and applications could be at the same level basically here, right? Important again, the idea of interface. The key word about GenAI applications is front-end interface. It's how all of these other services are exposing services resources to be consumed downstream by actual users or other applications, right? It's very common that we mention this multi-agent. Somebody here commenting on ADK, just building these multi-agent environments with agents will be orchestrated and interact among themselves to deliver certain functionality, right? Application that tries, you see, an agent is an application, right, that tries to achieve a goal, but observing the world, again, being able, this is the idea of autonomy, right, being able to observe, to interpret something that is happening within the environment. It's not the world, it's the environment, right, something that the agent itself can reach, right, and acting and making a decision about performing something, acting upon it using tools. Again, not sure if this is a great definition, but it's very useful to introduce this important concept, right? Goal, acting, and tools. This is very important. I would comment also the fact that agents should also be able to connect with other agents, right? That's another important element here that you need to consider. How do agents relate to GenAI powered applications, right? So understand and respond to natural language. Agents allow applications to have more intuitive interfaces that can understand complex requests. You can use all of these mechanisms. Again, tomorrow we're going to talk more about that. Prompt engineering is one of the key techniques here to make sure that the agents have at hand the proper mechanisms to interpret what they need to achieve, basically understand the goal that they need to achieve, right? The process of automation, they can handle multi-step processes within an application. Again, this idea of orchestrating or synchronizing multiple agents within an application to achieve a specific goal. And of course, customization, beyond customization, I would say customization on steroids, as we usually say, by personalization. It's beyond customization, right? They can run user preferences and configure, tailor the application accordingly, right? Not to the custom level, to the person level, to the user level. That's the idea here. Okay? So multi-agent system, this is the idea of multi-agent, right? We are talking about multi-agent solutions here, application in GenAI power application. The travel booking app, this is my favorite scenario, by the way, travel booking apps, customer support, contact center, customer service, call centers, chatbots. These are the typical applications supported by GenAI-based chatbots. On personalized learning app. We're going to talk tomorrow about, I don't know, Notebook LM. One of the key products that Google is promoting nowadays is Notebook LM, which in a way is this kind of personalized learning app. You will see that tomorrow if you're not familiar with Notebook LM, right? So this is, as I said, is one of the, in my opinion, one of the most relevant or scenarios to discuss these multi-agent systems. One agent handles the complex task of finding the best flights and hotels. This is essentially setting up a goal like this. Listen, you can talk to the agent, right? And you can tell, listen, in June I will have 1 week off at work. So I'm gonna have 1 week on vacation. So I'm gonna go with my partner. We are 2 people. We wanna go to a place. I don't know, it's a big city near the beach. I need to go to the sea and to the beach and near the ocean, but also needs to be a big city with activities because I like to go to, I don't know, concerts or to a theater. There needs to be a big city nearby. And this is my budget. And this is some of my limitations. Go. And that's it. That's all what you provide. And then somehow this travel booking app should handle internally these agents to deliver that particular request. One agent will be responsible for finding the best flights and hotels. Another agent with different tools will be looking for activities to do, attractions and all of that. Another agent will be dealing with bookings and reservations and making payments maybe online to book a hotel or flight tickets, looking for the best flights, maybe making recommendations about flying to a different destination because it would be significantly cheaper. I don't know, those kind of things. You can go as deep as you want in terms of the complexity of the functionality that those agents can address. But the point is, these agents should autonomously go out there. This going out there means interacting with these external tools and services to deliver and achieve that specific goal. Again, my goal is to spend a week on vacation in one specific type of destination, right? The application provides the user with the interface for browsing options and making reservations. Again, the agent, we're going to talk, we as users, we're going to interact with these agents via the application. The application is essentially this front end, as we mentioned already a few times, that will handle the interfaces between this agentic model, not model, I don't want to use model because it's confusing with the actual foundation model, but this environment of agents interacting among themselves and the requests and responses that we generate for the target user, right? Customer support answers common questions, troubleshoot problems, escalates complex issues to human representative. This is the typical chatbot contact center, call center application, right? Chat interface and integrates with other support systems. So the application will provide this conversational interface, we call chat interface, and then behind the scenes, the agents will be dealing with questions. Probably here we're going to use these grounding techniques that we saw before, querying a database or doing Google search, those kind of things, right? And then personalized learning application assesses student knowledge, recommends relevant learning materials, and generate personalized exercises. The application will provide the structure for lessons and track progress. Again, tomorrow we're going to introduce two applications that Google created. One is called Gemini Enterprise. The other one is called Notebook LM, and both could be considered part of this. They're different, but we can use them to customize, to personalize. Again, this is beyond customization, it's personalized an environment with relevant information. Let's review how agents work. There are two types of agents, as I mentioned before. Conversational agent, this is one example. You provide the input, you type a message or speak to the agent. Again, it's expected that this agent should be via the application, should be able to handle different interfaces or different channels like voice or chat. The agent understands, this is how the agents use models to understand natural language processing. The agent will make a decision, will reason about the request and make a decision, and in order to do something, to perform an action, and for that action may need to interact with the tool, call a tool, the agent generates a response, and the agent will deliver. Via, again, the application is collecting the input, parsing the input from the user, and delivering the response, right? Answering questions, chatting casually, accessing information, those kind of applications. Workflow agents, even though we have the same thing, you see the same kind of workflow here. You provide the input, the agent understands. This is the framework, right? The generic framework that agents should support, as you can see, regardless which kind of a specific application they are addressing, right? E-commerce order fulfillment, customer onboarding, automated research, security log. This travel agent that I just mentioned is another example of a workflow agent coordinating and orchestrating multiple activities, right? Everything that requires multiple activities that needs to be somehow coordinated or orchestrated, we work with these workflow agents, right? So consider these examples here: conversational, answering questions, chatting casually, accessing information, workflow, e-commerce. This is what this is. Select one of these solutions and describe a specific challenge in your organization that the agent could help address. This is the kind of activities that you see here that normally we would skip this because this format of this delivery, this course today is not about running these activities in group, but I leave that. Remember, I told you at the beginning that I decided to keep these slides here because you can use it later on when you receive an email with the link to these decks, with this information. You can look for this and use it to reflect on this. That could be very useful to help you think in terms of how to handle requirements to be addressed by these solutions, right? Okay, just looking at the chat. So, agent use cases. Let's introduce some basic use cases. Customer service, answer questions, resolve issues, provide personalized recommendations. We mentioned that already. Productivity, employee productivity agents, help workers find information, manage tasks, automate workflow. This repetitive, time-consuming. Remember, we discussed those scenarios. Remember earlier when we talked about augmented activities versus automation, right? This is, you will see now direct applicability of those concepts here. Customer service agents could be associated with augmented activities like provide personalized recommendation, whereas productivity agent may be associated with automation, right? Automate common and simple workflow or repetitive workflows. And then creative agents generate new ideas, create content and translation, for instance, right? Create code. Code agents, they are very good, very good. The model, not the agent, but the model that the agent uses are usually very good at programming and handling programming languages, writing, review, debugging code. My favorite feature by far is documentation. I spent a few years working as a programmer, as a developer, and I would love, I'm talking about several years ago, way before AI and machine learning, and I wish we had at the time these tools for especially debugging and generating documentation and test cases. Generating code, very interesting, but it's not my main my main feature. I would focus on debugging and reviewing and documenting, which is usually what developers don't enjoy very much, right? Analyze large data sets, identify trends, and extract insights. Another typical example of an agent that is augmented what data analysts, business intelligence, business analysts do, right? Analyze especially large data sets and help find, this is, if you will, this is kind of the typical unsupervised approach that we mentioned before. Find this hidden correlation or references among data elements, right? And security, automate security tasks. Use these agents to help us implement security or safer mechanism or detect vulnerabilities. These agents could be very good at helping identify, and this is, by the way, something that Google does now on Google Cloud Platform. You can run a recommendation engine that will look for vulnerability issues in security and make recommendations to improve that, right? Permissions that you need to remove, and those kind of things. Services that nobody's using and you have it there up and running. So you can use these agents to navigate your environment and collect information and improve the way that we implement security on that, right? Gen AI agents, just talk about this beyond models. Again, the reasoning loop, again, two very important concepts here. Reasoning loop, right? This idea again that we mentioned when we introduced reinforcement learning about iterative process, right? Advanced prompt engineering framework to guide its decision-making process. A lot of important concepts in this sentence here. Reasoning loop, prompt engineering, and decision-making process, right? How to affect the decision-making process. Simple rule-based calculation, complex thought change, machine learning algorithms, probabilistic reasoning techniques. These are all frameworks that can be implemented when we set our agents and define the goal, right? And then we use, tomorrow I will walk you through this React, reasoning and acting. This is directly the key mechanism operating inside an agent, right? React refers to reasoning and acting, deciding to do something and doing it. And then that is connected to the idea of feedback, collecting the responses and using that to keep reasoning and acting, right? This loop that we mentioned before, this reasoning loop that you see here, right? This is very important. We'll talk about chain of thought tomorrow, how to split a complex task in intermediate steps so we can see this idea of traceability, this idea of interpretability. We talk about explainability, interpretability in the previous section. Chain of thought is one of the prompting techniques that could potentially help understanding or interpreting or explaining better why the model is doing whatever it's doing, right? So what is the primary purpose of a Gen AI agent? Generate creative content? No. To achieve a specific goal by observing its environment, reasoning and acting upon it using available tools? I like it. to function only as a platform for building other AI models? No. Passively provide information is exactly the opposite of passively doing something, right? So achieve a specific goal, of course, that's the right answer. What is the relationship between GenAI agents and GenAI powered application? Question that I saw there in the chat, right? What is the relationship between GenAI agents and GenAI powered applications? GenAI agents are intelligent component that functions within a larger GenAI powered application which provides the user interface and overall goals. I like that one. What do you think? GenAI agents are standalone entities that operate independently of any application. They are not standalone. They are not standalone. GenAI powered applications are simply another name for GenAI agent. That is incorrect. GenAI agents define the user interface and overall goals, while applications handle the specific complex tasks, which is quite the opposite, right? So A is the right answer. Agents are the components of an application that will handle the front end and, again, the contextual framework for those agents to operate. The scope, for instance, right? This idea of tools that would be available for agents to consume. There is a cost, by the way, associated with that we need to discuss. A company is looking to implement a system where AI guides new customers through the account setup process, provides interactive tutorials, and answers their initial frequently asked questions. Which category of GenAI agents is best suited for these customer onboarding tasks, right? Conversational agents, creative agents, or security agent, or a workflow agent. This idea of orchestrating multiple activities by implementing probably multiple agents interacting is defined by this framework as a workflow agent, right? What two key elements distinguish AI agents from standalone large language models, LLMs, right? And empower them to tackle complex problems and manage multi-step tasks. Two key elements. The question is, what two key elements distinguish AI agents from the large language model? Pre-build, custom create, the user advanced prompt. So this is a very, very interesting question because I need to highlight, I need to stress out here how important it is to understand that at the very core of an agent service, we have a reasoning loop and we have the capacity to connect and use external tools. An agent is as or could perform as well as the accessibility to the proper tools required to achieve a specific goal. Again, a tool could be something as simple as we saw before, like doing a Google search and ingesting the search results for the agent to do something with that. It could be as simple as that, other than APIs to query an internal database or accessing a specific, I don't know, internal mechanisms to interpret certain results. There are different ways to implement these tools, right? But it's usually associated with some kind of API